Hello, my name is Peri and I'm the current Vice President for the SUNY New Paltz LARP Club. In the last video, I covered how to make a character so that you could have an entertaining experience in LARP even if you weren't sure what to do. This time I'm going to be covering something a bit different. This time I want to cover character etiquette. Character etiquette is a huge topic to consider because it doesn't just cover creation. It covers mechanical issues, role-playing issues, as well as the fact that that etiquette doesn't only apply to PCs, but NPCs as well, and there's entirely different rules for all those circumstances. So, I'm going to walk you through each section and how you might be a better role player and have your character more liked, more entertained, and have better relationships with your fellow LARPers. Alright, so the first one is mechanical. Combat is a pretty common thing in most LARPs, so it can be a bit awkward when you have physical players, violent players, and attacking other people who you might not even know. So there's a few rules to consider. First is the touching rule. While you might have a character who might go around hugging people, or go around punching people in the face, or just grabbing them and interrogating them violently, it's not always a good idea to enact that directly on the person. If you know them directly, there's nothing wrong with this, and most of the time people will understand the boundaries. But sometimes new people show up, and you're not sure. One LARP that I went to actually had a really good system for that, which is where you would take a spell packet, or a spacket, or some sort of representative, and you would touch them with that. In that way, you never actually had to touch them directly. Another thing is to not actually grab them, but to form a fist right in front of them, and then say what you do. For instance, in our LARP we have the word strength, which you can use as an indicative that you are stronger than them. So, I would take my hand, make a fist, and put it by their arm, right here, not touching them, and saying, strength, I drag you, and then I would walk around, and they could act like they were being dragged. Those are some great ways to actually address the fact that not everyone is going to want to be touched, even if your character would in fact do it. If you're unsure, though, it's highly recommended that you actually talk to the person out of character and ask if it's okay. And if you don't have time to do it beforehand, try and at least talk to them after the matter, because if you made a mistake, it's better to not do it again than to continue on with that person having the wrong impression of you. This also includes verbal violence. For instance, I have a character who likes to yell at people's faces, and not everyone's going to be okay with that. So that's something else you should also be wary of, and in general try and make sure people are okay with it beforehand. Also, if you do that, try and make sure you have a good breath beforehand. No one wants bad breath. The other one is the rule of combat. Not everyone is going to be the puppy dog that's going to go and tackle people into the ground. Some people are pretty timid with the swords or the spells, and you know what? That's okay. So, one thing to keep in mind is that when you're facing a new person, try not to show off, try not to go all out, and if you're unsure of what they're doing, go easy on them, at least for the first few times. However, that's not to say go easy in skill, so much as don't try and pull your shit out, do a battle cry, and try and slam into them for this because you know that you and your friends are allowed to do that because you're okay if you give each other bruises. These rules are pretty much common sense. Basically, if you don't know them well enough, exercise caution until you know them better. In larger LARPs, there's usually very strictly defined rules of what you have to do with everyone, but in smaller LARPs, there might be a bit more leeway. Now, the next is NPCs, because the role-playing one is going to take forever, because that has so many stuff to do with it. NPCs are not PCs. There are two factions to the NPC side. One, you have the mooks, I am here with my 10 HP and my 1 damage, and I'm gonna die. And I am here to die, and that was my only purpose in life. And then you have the side that's like, well, this NPC could have, a husband and kid at home. This NPC could have a very important cabbage business. And these two sides don't always conflict so well. Now, this is my personal opinion, but I think most people will agree with me once you get to the official scale, is that flavor text for NPCs is interesting. We enjoy seeing depth to NPCs. However, NPCs exist for the sake of the player. Now, what does this have to do with etiquette? Simple. If you are an NPC, unless you are specifically in the spotlight for a specific reason, you shouldn't hog the attention from PCs. You should no-sell stuff. I mean, unless you're supposed to. You shouldn't try and flee from a battle just because you think your character would, especially for those 10 HP mooks that are there to provide a challenge. Now, if you are said, okay, Here's your shopkeeper. You have to give them a hard time. And have fun with it. You're stalling. We forgot to add another part because we're LARP plot and we suck. Then, you know what? Go out. Do what they said. That's fine. But sometimes you're in a situation where the president or whoever's in charge couldn't tell you what to do. For example, you are Mook number 5 with your 10 HP, but they don't kill you. And instead they tie you up and they're going to use you as an interrogation and then a bargaining chip. Then you gotta roleplay. So then, that is when you have to realize that you are subservient to what the PCs are doing. You can fight back, you can make a show of it, but ultimately, you want to make sure that what you're doing is entertaining for the sake of the players, not entertaining for the sake of yourself. And I have seen this happen a lot, especially when you have characters who are not immortal so much as GM protected, where they're there for comic relief, people like them. You killing them is not going to be the best of ideas. Sometimes they're too strong for that, sometimes there's just not much of a reason to do it, but these characters tend to be a problem because, one, it means people get the idea that there's nothing they can do to stop them, and more importantly, it means that sometimes these characters can get god complexes. And what that means is that they assume that nothing can stop them from completely overrunning the LARP at the time. And with these characters especially, you have to maintain the balance between serving the player and being subservient to them, and also making it seem like that's not the case. You essentially have to play the magician's trick of they get to think they're making the choice even though you're controlling the situation at hand to make sure it's more entertaining. Whenever you're NPCing, you are a service to the player. That doesn't mean you have to be dull or bland, but you are serving the players. You are not serving yourself, and that is one of the most important rules I can say in LARP. So if you find yourself playing an NPC, keep that in mind, because you'll be liked a lot better if you play a really good NPC and you listen to people, and if they come up with something creative, you can go with it, and that can also be excellent. People get really happy when they figure out unique ways to thwart or interact with NPCs. And all it takes is a really willing NPC. Okay. Next we have role-playing. I'm laughing because I could talk for hours about characters and role-playing etiquette. I have stories upon stories of role-playing gone bad, so I'm going to try and keep this somewhat short. Okay, so the first thing to consider in LARP is really basic, is that LARP is emotionally hard. You go in, you experience a lot of emotions, a lot of adrenaline, and then it ends. And you know, this isn't always a big deal for some people, but it can be. For instance, I play a character who is really mean, really abrasive, and usually gets into fights with people, verbally. And what happens is that when LARP ends, I suddenly get the feeling of, why was I so mean? I'm not a mean person. And then you get this weird crash, the differentiation between the fact of what your character does and what you do are two different things. So even though you're used to the results of what you as a person gets, you're getting different results because it's a character. There are other reasons. The other reason could just be the fact that you have to roleplay really high emotions of sadness, crying, anger, and then that lingers. Now, this isn't really so much what to do about it, so much as that it's important to recognize. It's important to recognize because the biggest issue with character etiquette is the player-character separation. And if you don't separate those emotions, or at least aren't aware that the emotional issues, you might be ended up having a bias because of your player thoughts and wants. My favorite story of this is we had a mission, and some of the LARPers tried to smuggle out an illegal drug. And they knew it was illegal because they hid an illusion over it, and they had to smuggle it past the guard patrol, and it was all very secret, and the GM was going to shill them out the money that they were going to get for selling it, so, you know, good for them. But then they told a PC who didn't want to do that. And then that PC told the PCs in charge, the general and the commander, and they got put on trial. Now, two things happened. One, the PCs argued that they shouldn't be put on trial. And the actual players also argued the exact same thing with the exact same arguments, up to and including getting mad at the GM, who wasn't in charge of the PC group at the time. They were not commander, they were not general. But they got mad at the GM as well, and blamed them for the issue. They also accused the GM and the entire thing of not making clear it was illegal. It was opium, by the way, and if the guard patrol and the fact that they were hiding in the first place didn't give it away, I think the historical context might have. They blame it on not making it clear enough, blah, 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 that it wasn't fair, stuff like that. To this day, it's one of my favorite stories because of the sheer amount of ludicrousness in it. But it's an example of the players were doing something because it was funny. You know, we're stealing opium, we're going to sell it, it's going to be great, it's going to be hilarious. And then when they had to deal with the in-world problems, they got annoyed because they forgot of the difference in there. Or, at least that's my assumption. It was kind of hard to ask them why specifically, because they were still convinced that we had kind of ran them for a loop. So that is a really good example of how player and character interactions can kind of go awkward. Another one is if two characters get into a fight, and both people agree with their character out of character. Because most people aren't going to argue what their character thinks if they completely think it's wrong. Most people have trouble doing that. If you can do it, good for you, but most people don't. So usually, while the character will argue it in a different way, go about it differently, at the end of the day, they're gonna still defend their character from an outsider's perspective. And this can lead to a lot of issues, because what happens is that you then have these two people who are convinced that they're right, and they think their characters are right, so they don't understand why people are arguing with them in and out of character. This can cause a lot of friendship issues, especially if you have morally gray issues. The classical one for D&D, which we don't really use, but it's a good example, is the lawful good character sees a bunch of orc babies who are completely always evil, and whether they should kill them or not. And that's an example of in-character biases versus out-of-game biases, because there is no one in this planet that is completely evil. Like, as a baby killing spree. Like, you can't kill babies. But, you can argue that that is an existence within the universe itself. So then you can argue that it's right only within that universe. And then you have the people who will probably say, no, it's not real here. Thus, it's still really horrible. And you can get these two different opinions for something that really doesn't apply in the real world, but will still get really clashing fights to go about it. There's a lot of other examples. If someone follows strict rules, like, for instance, you have a trial, like I mentioned before, and there are very strict rules of how the trial is handled, and the character feels like they were given an unfair time, even though it was following the law. Or, they get screwed over just because of a luck of a draw. At one point, someone decides that they're gonna be more harsh about this, just as you are doing that, and suddenly you get in trouble when no one else previously did. There can be a lot of issues with that, and unfortunately, it can travel to the players. And it's really important to keep that in mind, because unfortunately, that can cause a lot of drama in and out of character, and it's always good to keep open communication because of that. And usually, in most circumstances, at least I've seen, the character getting, like, ruined or screwed over is usually fair. There are, however, exceptions to this. But for the most part, as a player, it's your job to take most of the lumps and decide when you are actually having an issue. Because if you complain every time, no one's going to believe you when you actually do have an issue of bias or someone ruining what should have happened. The other issue of character-player separation is friendships. Like I said, LARP's an emotionally high game. And sometimes, if you have friendship issues outside of the game, they can travel inside the game. Now, this isn't always a bad thing. For instance, now in my LARP, we have a commander and a general. We have two people in charge, and we get to pick who gets to do it. We have to consider who would be best in character. But we also need to consider who would be best out of character. If you are playing the really strong, like, warrior, has a bunch of honors and stuff, that'd be a great consideration. But if out of character, I know that you are timid, really bad at interactions and stuff, and maybe even new, I might not consider it just because it wouldn't be good for the player to handle such stress. So in some cases, it can be a good thing. It's just the issue of, well, where do you find that magic line? Another example is if you have an excellent character but you don't show up that much. And maybe in world you do because of how the system's set up, but you can't actually be there because you are off in the real world doing something else. So that's another way that player character issues can actually become much more grounded than just completely separate the two and never address it. Another problem is, especially when you get teenagers and young people are crushes. You have a crush on someone in or out of character that can often cause an issue if there's not completely clear communication. As a general rule, if there is an out-of-character crush, you might not want to travel that into the in-character, unless you're both okay with it. It will get awkward, it will get messy. Don't do it. Please don't. Alright. That should cover most of that. Basically, keep aware that there's a player, there's a character, and they are separate, but there might be reasons to also consider them one and the same when you are dealing with power structures, drama, etc., etc. And the last thing to deal with that is a lot of people, when they go into LARPs, will make their first character a self-insert. That's not a bad thing. People sometimes need to be familiar before they go into the strange and weird. The problem is that they're usually slightly different, a bit more fantastical, a bit more out there, a bit more hammy. So what do you do when someone says, I don't like your PC, they're too mean, they're too selfish, they're not that smart, I can't stand them, and they're based off of you. And that is something that you have to be really careful about. Also, the same thing goes if this character's your baby, which is just a term meaning you love them, and everyone loves their character, but I see this more as self-inserts, but if you do have a character you hold precious, keep this in mind. You need to understand that people tend to see characters differently than people. And even when people don't, and even people who don't, they'll usually dislike it on a writing basis instead. Disliking a character is very rarely a case of disliking the person, unless you bring out-of-character biases into it. Most of the time when I've seen people actually hate the person as well as the character is when they've let their out-of-character knowledge, out-of-character biases control their character. For instance, I once heard of a guy who was going to have his character assassinate these two other characters. You know, completely fine. But he was using his out-of-character knowledge of what spells they had, what skills they had, when they went on guard duty, aka NPC duty, to do it. And that was a case of people actually being annoyed at him and disliking him as the result. But usually that's not the case. That's usually the exception, not the rule. So it's important to keep in mind that even if a character hates your character, that doesn't mean they hate you. And if you do think that, and if you do think there's an issue there, talk to that person, or find a mediator, because oftentimes what you'll find is that your character is not as similar to you as you think. Sometimes they have every single trait except for one, and that one trait can make all the difference. Execution is hugely different, because to a certain extent, a really overbearing person can be motherly or really invasive, just depending on how they do it. So that is something to keep in mind. Alright, I've talked about that way too much. The next part is bragging. Bragging. Everyone has amazing LARP stories. Everyone has incidents where they were awesome or stuff they love to do. And this is something to keep in mind. Most people aren't going to care too much. Now, I'm not saying that you should never talk about yourself, but what I'm saying is that oftentimes people will talk about themselves over and over again and never let the other person talk. Or they will constantly bring it back to them. And LARP stories are fun, but what you have to keep in mind is that everyone wants to tell those stories. Everyone wants that moment to feel like their character did something awesome. So, what you should be doing when you tell stories is either A, use this as an antidote. For instance, I mentioned my story about the trial. I am not doing that to say, oh, look at my character. I'm saying, hey, here's an example of something. Now, if this wasn't a video, but a two-way conversation, I was speaking with another LARPer who I knew was also experienced, I would leave a gap there and see if they actually wanted to say anything else. See if they had a story of their own. If you were going to be telling stories or stuff, try and let other people also tell stories. Have it be an exchange. And react appropriately. How would you want to react if you were telling a story? Would you want people to wait silently and then say, oh, well, my character, or, well, one time in my tabletop, no, you don't. You want people to be like, oh, that's weird. Oh, that was fun. That was so cool. Are you sure you did that? Man, you're people. Woo, I thought my LARPers were bad. I'm not saying fake it, but I'm saying actually listen, actually pay attention. And if they don't do the same to you, then maybe they're not worth your time to tell the stories, and you shouldn't listen to them. But at the same time, I see a lot of good-hearted LARPers doing this, and I think it's something to keep in mind, especially for new LARPers. If they do a small thing like, I downed an enemy, woo! Even though you've done like 50 in the past minute, you say, oh, that's great, how'd you do it? What'd you do? Let them talk. Let them feel like they are important, because low-level characters always have the hardest time getting into it, because the fact of the matter is that they are usually low-level, well, they're always low-level, but they usually don't know how to use the system that well, and even the smallest amount of victory is surprising to them. And, yeah, so basically, if you're gonna, like, go off of stories, see if they have any of their own. If they don't, keep a gauge of their interest. If they don't seem interested, ask them questions. How did you like your LARP? What did you think? Did you do anything funny? Ha! I really like that line you said. Keep it two-way. Don't keep it one way. One way feels like a Vanity Fair. And the last thing I want to deal with is shilling. Shilling kind of falls under everything else, but I like to keep it separate because it can be very subtle. This is especially true when you're describing it to other people, and sometimes it doesn't even have to be your own character, but sometimes you have a character, and you want people to like them. You want them to be aware of how awesome your character is. So you'll drop hints of like, oh, my character's so awesome, or oh, my brave, like, George warrior didn't even flinch, and they sliced his head off, it was awesome. Now, half of that is bragging. But if you do it continuously, sometimes it can come off as shilling, which is essentially you selling your character over and over and over again in an attempt for people to understand that your character is awesome. When it's better having your actions speak for yourself. So, you know, you can tell that one story of the time your character didn't flinch, or the time you took control of your group or whatever. But you might be better off leaving general adjectives out of it, because unfortunately this wasn't a story. This is your character. This is how you acted it out. So instead of saying like they had like this, like George, and if George is my character, had a really calm gaze and breathed fire out of their eyes, and it was really intense, say, I stared at them with like intense eyeballs, and it was intense, because what you have there is the difference of my character, who's an extension of myself, did this awesome thing, as opposed to, hey, this is what I did, attempted to do. Obviously, it depends on the person, and there's nothing wrong with saying it, but sometimes if you write characters in such a way that makes it feel like they're separate from all of us, and you're talking about, like characters on TV, it can seem a bit grating, it can seem a bit like you're pushing them up. I've seen this happen a lot of times, mostly, oddly enough, in writing. I've noticed it a lot in writing, so actually the whole I thing doesn't work so well there. But I think it's something to keep in mind. And a lot of people do it because they want to keep in mind that their character is liked, or because they want someone else to think their character is liked. And I find that is a really cheap way to do it, because anyone who's not part of that just gets annoyed. There are a lot more things I could talk about with etiquette. In general stuff like, let's see. If you're in combat and you think someone's cheating, or if you think someone did something wrong, don't stop combat, don't stop it, take it and go, talk about it later. If you have an issue with the system, if you have an issue with the president, tell them later, after the session. There's nothing worse than a player stopping everything to argue with the president or the person in charge about the logistics of a spell and to whether it can do something or not. And as a result, I think it's very important to also keep in mind other such things. Not everyone's the same. Not everyone's going to react to LARP the same, and it's important to keep that in mind. Everyone has different sensibilities. In my LARP, for example, we don't have any spiders, because we have several members who are arachnophobic. So we kept that in mind, and we decided to accommodate them as opposed to kicking them out. Now, and this is also important in LARP because not everyone's going to be physically fit. So not everyone is going to be great with a sword. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind when you're creating the system or creating puzzles. For instance, one thing we were planning on doing is having a race where people had to run away from a bad guy. And what we had to consider was, alright, who can't run? Those should probably be the ones who are NPCing. Who can't run but has skills that will let them dodge or be able to avoid things? They can run because they have stuff that we've supplied them to make sure they don't have to worry about bad feet or asthma or something to that extent. In general, all I can really say is listen to your players, listen to each other, and keep in mind that the people in charge are not your enemies, and most people get into character and they are pretty okay at separating it. However, Not everyone is, so it's important that you, viewer, are good at it. You can do it, so that when other people do it, you see what they're doing, and you understand that it's just in character, and even if it's not, at least your character is. I could go on a lot more, like I've said, but I think I've almost talked for 24 minutes. Look at that. So that's all I really have to say. If you have any other questions, well, I'm a video, so you can't actually talk to me. But discuss it with people. If you actually go to my LARP, well, not my LARP, if you go to the LARP I am part of, you know where I am, you can talk to me. And if you don't, and you're just seeing a random face on the internet, then, I don't know, you got nothing to lose if you disagree with me. Alright, that's it. Happy LARPing.